Chuck to the rise. The story of Deric "Tuna" McGuire does not begin in the thunder of motorcycles or the flash of police raids, but in the quiet backroads of Burrillville, Rhode Island. It is a town that wears its New England heritage proudly. Old mill buildings stand stubbornly against the years. Forests stretch long across rolling hills. And everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least thinks they do. In this world, a boy like Deric grew restless. He was bigger than most of the kids around him, quick with a joke that could make you laugh, just as quick with a punch that could knock you flat. Teachers called him smart but undisciplined. Neighbors muttered that he had that look, the look of someone destined for trouble. But what they didn't know was that trouble would soon have a name, a patch, and a roar that echoed across highways. By his teenage years, Deric had already begun to flirt with the outlaw lifestyle. He was fascinated by the chrome machines that thundered past Burrillville's quiet streets in packs. Motorcycles weren't just transportation to him. They were symbols of escape, of defiance. When other kids saved up for cars, Deric scraped together money for a battered old bike, one that leaked oil but carried him far enough down the road to feel free. That feeling, that rush of wind and the vibration of the engine beneath him, was addictive. It wasn't long before he began hanging around older riders, men with leather jackets and reputations, men who seemed to live by no rules except their own. Among those riders were members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club, one of the most notorious outlaw biker gangs on the East Coast. The Pagans had been born in the 1950s, founded by Lou Dobkin in Maryland, and over the decades they had spread like wildfire, recruiting men who wanted freedom but found brotherhood in something darker. Unlike their rivals, the Hells Angels, the Pagans kept a lower profile, less concerned with selling merchandise and more concerned with controlling territory. They prided themselves on their ferocity, on their willingness to go to war for their patch. By the time Deric crossed paths with them, the Pagans had already been engaged in decades of blood feuds, drug empires, and underground dealings that kept them on law enforcement's radar. To a young man like Deric, they were legends, dangerous, respected, untouchable. Deric earned the nickname Tuna somewhere along the line, though stories differ as to why. Some say it came from a fishing trip gone wrong. Others claim it was an inside joke, one of those names that sticks whether you like it or not. But in the outlaw world, a nickname is a baptism. It marks the moment when you stop being just another man and start being part of a mythology. Tuna became his identity, the name whispered in bars and shouted across garages. When people said it, they weren't just talking about Deric McGuire anymore. They were talking about a man who was carving his way into the outlaw world. Rising through the ranks of a motorcycle club is no simple task. It takes more than just riding a bike or drinking at the clubhouse. It requires proving yourself in fights, in deals, in loyalty tested under fire. Tuna learned quickly. He had the size to intimidate, the fist to back it up, and the year charm to draw people toward him. He became the man who could turn a losing bar fight into a victory, the one who knew when to throw a punch and when to buy a round. His brothers began to trust him with more. Small errands at first, then bigger jobs. A delivery here, a collection there. Tuna never asked too many questions. He just got it done. That reliability, that mix of muscle and silence, made him invaluable. But there was more to Tuna than brute force. He had a kind of streetwise intelligence, the ability to see angles others missed. He could sense when someone was about to cross him, and he knew how to talk people into deals that always seemed to favor him. This made him stand out. In a world where many bikers were content to live for the next ride, Tuna was already thinking about the next move, the next way to expand, the next chance to turn outlaw brotherhood into power. By his late 20s, Tuna was no longer just a prospect or a hanger-on. He was a fully patched member, wearing the Pagans' infamous death head logo on his back. The patch wasn't just leather and thread, it was armor. It told the world that he belonged to something bigger, something feared. And in Rhode Island, it made him one of the most dangerous men on the streets. The years that followed cemented his reputation. Tuna became known not only in Rhode Island, but across New England. Other chapters of the Pagans respected him. Some even feared him. He had a knack for organizing, for keeping his men in line without making them feel like they were being controlled. In a subculture that prided itself on freedom, that balance was rare. He could be brutal when he needed to be, but he could also be loyal to the point of generosity. If a brother needed cash, Tuna found a way. If a brother got in trouble, Tuna was the one making calls, pulling strings, or showing up at the door with reinforcements. This combination of fear and loyalty propelled him upward. By the time he hit his late 30s, Tuna had done more than rise through the ranks. He had taken the throne. He became the president of the Rhode Island chapter of the Pagans, a position that placed him at the center of a web of drugs, guns, money, and power. To his men, he was more than just a leader. He was the embodiment of what the Pagans stood for. To his enemies, he was a storm they would rather avoid. To law enforcement, he was a target painted in neon. The rise of Deric "Tuna McGuire is the story of a man who found his identity in the roar of an engine and the shadow of a death head patch. But as with every outlaw king, the same ambition that lifted him high would soon draw the eyes of those determined to bring him down. The roads of Rhode Island carried him toward power, but they also carried him closer to a reckoning that no amount of fists, cash, or loyalty could stop. The reign. The moment Deric "Tuna McGuire pulled on the president's patch of the Rhode Island Pagans, the air seemed to shift. His rise was no longer just a personal triumph. It was a declaration. In biker culture, the patch is everything: identity, loyalty, power. And for Tuna, it became the crown of a kingdom he ruled not with law, but with force, fear, and the kind of charisma that can make even criminal enterprise feel like family tradition. The clubhouse became his throne room. From the outside, it looked like little more than a weathered garage with flickering neon, the kind of place you drive past without a second glance. But inside, it was alive with smoke, laughter, and the ever-present thrum of outlaw energy. The smell of spilled beer mixed with gasoline, cigarette smoke curled in the corners, and the walls bore the scars of years of fights, celebrations, and deals. To outsiders, it was chaos. To Tuna, it was order, his order. Every night, the clubhouse buzzed with activity. Members in leather vests leaned against pool tables, their patches gleaming in the dim light. Women drifted in and out, some drawn by the thrill of outlaw romance, others tied to the club through deeper loyalties. In the corner, deals were made quietly, in whispers over crumpled bills and small bags. And always in the center of it all was Tuna. Sometimes laughing, sometimes scowling, but always commanding attention. When Tuna spoke, people listened. When Tuna moved, people followed. But behind the rough charm of clubhouse nights, the machinery of his empire churned. Tuna's reign was built on more than beer and bravado. Drugs flowed through his hands like water through a spigot. Cocaine was his primary trade, moving in steady streams across Rhode Island's neighborhoods. He didn't deal in dime bags, he dealt in weight. His men cut, measured, and distributed, ensuring the product reached every corner where demand thrived. Marijuana added another layer, feeding the constant hunger of local buyers. It wasn't just about profit, it was about control. If someone in Rhode Island wanted cocaine or weed, chances were they were paying, directly or indirectly, into Tuna's pocket. Guns added another layer of power. 8 pistols would later be found stashed among his possessions, but the true count was far higher. Tuna wasn't just arming his men, he was moving weapons into hands that were forbidden by law to hold them. Felons, enforcers, people who needed the power of steel in their grip. Tuna made it happen. To him, guns weren't just tools of violence, they were currency, bargaining chips, the kind of leverage that could buy loyalty faster than cash. And then there were the cars. To outsiders, the presence of flashy vehicles around the clubhouse seemed like nothing more than outlaw indulgence. But beneath the shine of chrome and the growl of engines were schemes far more sophisticated. Fraudulent paperwork snaked its way through dealerships and loan offices. Cars worth tens of thousands shifting from one name to another until the trail blurred. These weren't just toys, they were assets, trade pieces in Tuna's sprawling web of crime. Fraud became a quiet but profitable side stream. False statements, doctored paperwork, schemes to trick banks and businesses. It was a reminder that Tuna's reach wasn't limited to the streets. He was willing to exploit the system itself, bending bureaucracy into another form of income. He wasn't just an outlaw biker. He was, in his own way, a businessman, though his boardroom was a garage, and his partners were men with patches and pistols. But ruling an empire requires more than product and profit. It requires loyalty, and Tuna knew how to cultivate it. He made sure his men felt taken care of. If a brother's family was short on rent, Tuna made a quiet drop of cash. If someone landed in jail, Tuna was there with bail money or a lawyer's number. If a rival so much as looked at a pagan wrong, Tuna was there with fists or worse. Loyalty in the outlaw world isn't built with promises, it's built with action. And Tuna delivered. This loyalty extended outward, into the streets. Shop owners in certain neighborhoods knew better than to cross him. Some paid quietly for protection, others simply looked the other way when pagan members moved through. Fear was as valuable a currency as money, and Tuna traded in it well. His name carried weight. To some it meant safety, to others it meant danger. But either way, it meant respect. Still, power attracts attention, and Tuna's empire was no exception. By 2017, whispers of his activities had grown loud enough to reach the ears of the Rhode Island State Police. Law enforcement had long known about the Pagans, their violence, their turf wars with rivals like the Hells Angels, their involvement in drugs and weapons. But Tuna's reign brought a new intensity. He wasn't just another biker moving small amounts of product. He was a chapter president running a multi-layered operation. That made him a priority. Thus began Operation Patched Out. It started quietly, with unmarked cars lingering on corners and officers taking notes on who came and went from the clubhouse. But soon it grew. Informants were flipped, men who had once raised glasses with Tuna, now carrying recorders in their pockets. Surveillance teams tracked his movements, documenting every trip, every exchange. Photos stacked up. Tuna outside the clubhouse, Tuna leaning against a car with a wad of cash, Tuna shaking hands with known dealers. Conversations recorded in hushed tones revealed more. Talk of cocaine, guns, deals in the works. For months, the operation expanded, weaving a net around him tighter with every passing day. But Tuna, for all his streetwise intelligence, seemed either unaware or unconcerned. Maybe he believed the patch made him untouchable. Maybe he thought law enforcement had bigger targets to chase. Or maybe he simply didn't care, too wrapped up in the rhythm of his reign to notice the noose tightening. Inside the clubhouse, life went on. Parties raged into the early hours. Deals continued. Engines roared as members rode in and out, their presence a constant reminder of pagan dominance in Rhode Island. Tuna at the center kept his empire moving with the confidence of a man who believed his kingdom would last forever. But history had already shown, time and time again, that outlaw kingdoms rarely endure. The very things that build them, violence, secrecy, ambition, are the same things that eventually bring them crashing down. And as Operation Patched Out gathered evidence, it became clear that Tuna's reign, however powerful, was living on borrowed time. Becoming too greedy, pocketing more than his share from drug shipments. Others resented his close circle of trusted lieutenants, men who got first pick of the cash, the women, and the weapons. The Brotherhood was supposed to be equal, a patch that made every man a brother. But behind the patch, envy festered. One night inside the clubhouse, the tension broke into the open. Music blared, smoke clouded the air, and bottles slammed against the tables. Tuna stood in the corner, talking to his right-hand man, when a younger patch, a hothead named Briggs, muttered too loudly. "Man, Tuna's living like a king while the rest of us scrape," Briggs said, voice slurred by whiskey. The room went quiet. Tuna turned slowly, eyes narrowing. In the pagan world, disrespect was a dangerous currency. He stepped closer, towering over the younger man. "You think you're owed something?" Tuna's voice was calm, but beneath it was steel. "You think this patch guarantees you a throne? You earn what you take. You bleed for it. You kill for it. That's how this works." Briggs swallowed hard but pushed back. "Maybe some of us bleed while others sit back and count the cash." The blow came fast, a fist across Briggs's jaw that dropped him to the floor. The clubhouse erupted, men pulling at each other, shouting, bottles smashing. When the chaos settled, Briggs was dragged outside, blood dripping from his lip, his pride shattered. No one challenged Tuna openly after that, but the whispers never stopped. While internal dissent simmered, external threats grew sharper. The Pagans' fiercest rivals, the Hells Angels, were never far away. In New England, the two clubs had drawn blood for decades, battling over territory, women, and respect. Tuna knew the Angels watched his every move. Every drug shipment through Rhode Island risked interception. Every pagan party risked a drive-by. The feud wasn't just old grudges, it was business. The Angels wanted Providence's cocaine flow, and the Pagans weren't about to surrender it. Skirmishes broke out in bars, parking lots, and highways. One night outside a dive bar in Woonsocket, a brawl between Angels and Pagans ended with 3 men hospitalized and 1 stabbed near the ribs. Tuna called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. The mood was tense, men pounding the table as he laid out his message. The Angels think we're weak. They think we're distracted. Let me be clear. No one, not them, not the cops, not anyone, takes this patch from us. If they want a war, we'll give them one. But war costs money, weapons, and loyalty, and those resources were stretched thin. Between rival fights, drug deals, and his own circle's greed, Tuna found himself constantly patching holes in his empire. Some members, disillusioned, began to wonder if loyalty to Tuna was worth the blood spilled. Others, sensing opportunity, reached out secretly to rivals or thought of breaking away. Inside Tuna's empire, Brotherhood was cracking. Outside, the Angels circled like vultures. And in the shadows, law enforcement sharpened its knives, watching as the Outlaw King fought wars on too many fronts. The net tightens. While Tuna fought to hold his empire together, another enemy moved quietly against him. Not with fists, but with patience. Law enforcement had long known about the Pagans, but Deric "Tuna" McGuire was different. He wasn't just another biker moving small bags of coke or trading guns under the table. He was orchestrating an empire that stretched beyond traditional outlaw lines, dipping into fraud, white-collar crime, and organized trafficking. For the Rhode Island State Police and federal partners, Tuna became priority number 1. Operation Patched Out was born. The strategy wasn't brute force, it was infiltration. Investigators embedded confidential informants inside Tuna's orbit. Some were minor criminals looking for lighter sentences. Others were burned-out members of the Brotherhood who saw betrayal as their only way out. These informants wore wires, recorded conversations, and reported every move Tuna made. In one recording, Tuna could be heard discussing a shipment of cocaine, his voice casual as if talking about groceries. In another, he bragged about selling firearms to felons, laughing at the idea of cops catching up. Every word became ammunition for the prosecutors, but wiretaps weren't enough. Undercover agents worked their way into the pagan world, posing as suppliers, mechanics, even hangarounds desperate to earn a patch. They drank with the men, laughed at their jokes, and slowly gained access to the heart of Tuna's operation. One agent, under deep cover, even rode with the Pagans on a highway run, his wire recording every shouted order and whispered plan. The surveillance spread wider. Drones tracked the clubhouse. Cameras were hidden in parking lots. Cell phone data was intercepted, showing who Tuna called, when, and where. The net was tightening, thread by thread, until escape was impossible. Tuna, paranoid, began to notice shadows where none should be. He warned his men to watch their words, to check their tails after every meeting. "The feds are always listening," he growled more than once. But outlaw arrogance blinded him. He believed fear kept the club sealed, that no brother would dare betray him. He was wrong. One of his trusted circle flipped. Facing prison time on unrelated charges, the man struck a deal with the feds. Overnight, someone who had once toasted Tuna with whiskey and blood became a ghost in his empire, feeding the law every detail they needed. By late 2018, investigators had built a case stronger than steel. They had drugs, guns, cash, and fraudulent documents, all tied back to Tuna. They had his voice on tape, his signature on fake paperwork, his fingerprints on the empire. The waiting game was over. The final piece was timing. To dismantle an empire, the strike had to be perfect. One clean sweep that left no room for recovery. Teams rehearsed the raid in secret facilities, maps laid out with precision, every door and window marked. They knew where Tuna slept, where the guns were hidden, how many seconds it would take to breach. Tuna didn't know it yet, but the war within his empire had already been decided. It wasn't the Hell's Angels or jealous brothers who would bring him down. It was the silent watchers, the patient hunters, who had circled him for years. The noose was ready. All that remained was the pull. The fall, the end of Deric Tuna. McGuire's reign did not arrive with a sudden explosion, but with the slow tightening of an invisible noose. For more than a year, law enforcement had tracked his every move. They had the photos, the recordings, the testimonies of men who had once toasted him as a brother, but now whispered his dealings into hidden microphones. Operation Patched Out was not designed for speed. It was designed for precision. Every detail mattered. Every thread had to be pulled until the entire tapestry of Tuna's empire unraveled in full view of the courts. By the summer of 2018, investigators had more than enough. They knew about the cocaine, nearly a pound moving in and out under Tuna's command. They knew about the firearms, 8 pistols, some traded into the hands of felons. They knew about the cars, the fraudulent loans, the paperwork twisted into schemes worth tens of thousands. It was a web too large to ignore, too dangerous to leave standing. The Pagans had always been a thorn in law enforcement's side, but with Tuna, the thorn had become a blade. The decision was made. The time had come to strike. The raid began before dawn on a September morning. Burrillville was still asleep, the mist clinging to the trees, when the quiet hum of armored vans rolled into the suburban streets. Tactical teams moved with swift precision, black-clad and armed, their boots pounding against asphalt as they surrounded Tuna's home. The sudden crash of a battering ram shattered the silence, followed by the flash and thunder of stun grenades. Inside, chaos erupted. Tuna, jolted from sleep, stumbled into the blinding lights and shouting commands. "Hands where I can see them!" The voices overlapped, sharp and unforgiving. He reached for his jeans, instinct clashing with confusion. But before he could move further, he was forced to the ground, cold steel biting into his wrists. For a man who had spent years commanding fear, it was a moment of helplessness that cut deeper than the cuffs themselves. The search of his home and garage was devastating in its revelations. Officers uncovered 8 pistols, carefully hidden yet undeniable in their presence. Nearly $30,000 in cash was pulled from drawers and containers, evidence of the underground economy that fueled his reign. Over 300 grams of cocaine were bagged, weighed, and cataloged, their existence undeniable proof of trafficking. 6 vehicles were seized, each tied to fraudulent paperwork that linked back to schemes far beyond the simple outlaw image of bikes and beer. Stacks of falsified documents emerged, showing attempts to trick banks and institutions, revealing that Tuna's empire was not just violent, but cunning, stretching into corners of white-collar crime where few expected to find an outlaw biker's fingerprints. The fall of a king is rarely quiet, and word of Tuna's arrest spread fast. Within hours, the clubhouse murmured with shock, members staring at one another in disbelief. The man they had seen as untouchable was now in custody, his empire dismantled piece by piece. Some whispered that the feds had finally caught up. Others muttered about betrayal, about informants who had worn the patch and turned against him. In the outlaw world, betrayal is worse than prison, and the idea that brothers had helped bring him down stung like salt in open wounds. For Tuna, the days that followed were a blur of hearings, interrogations, and the slow grind of the legal machine. The charges stacked against him read like a catalog of outlaw crime: possession with intent to deliver cocaine, illegal possession of firearms, conspiracy to traffic drugs, conspiracy to sell guns without licenses, selling to felons, conspiracy to receive stolen goods, fraud, false statements. Each charge was a brick in the wall closing in around him. His past did him no favors. In 2014, he had been convicted of assault with a dangerous weapon, a history that made his possession of firearms all the more damning. Prosecutors painted him not as a misguided man, but as a career criminal, a danger to the community, the embodiment of everything law enforcement had warned about the Pagans. To them, this was not just about one man. It was about sending a message. The courtroom became the stage for the final act of his story. October 27, 2022, Providence Superior Court. The wooden benches creaked as spectators settled, reporters scribbled notes, and officers stood guard. Tuna entered in shackles, heavier now, the weight of years of outlaw living visible in his face. He was no longer the laughing king of the clubhouse, but a defendant facing the cold eyes of justice. Justice Robert Kraus presided, his reputation for stern sentencing well known. The prosecution laid out the case with clinical precision. The drugs, the guns, the cash, the cars, the fraud. Photos flashed on screens, recordings were played, the evidence overwhelming. The Attorney General's office described Tuna as a significant risk to Rhode Island, a man whose empire had endangered communities, spread addiction, and armed those already forbidden to carry weapons. Tuna's defense attorney spoke of reform, of a man capable of change, but the words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. To fight the charges outright would have been suicidal. The choice was clear: a plea. When Tuna stood, his voice was low, steady, but stripped of the bravado that once defined him. Nolo contendere, no contest, neither an admission of guilt nor a proclamation of innocence, just resignation. The words hung in the courtroom like smoke, marking the end of his fight. The sentence fell with the finality of a gavel. 20 years, 10 to serve, 10 suspended, 20 years probation. Along with it, the forfeiture of $80,229 in cash and 6 cars tied to his schemes. For the man who had once commanded streets, it was a crushing fall. For the state, it was a victory. For the Pagans, it was a wound that would scar their Rhode Island chapter for years to come. Inside prison walls, Tuna's world shrank to the size of a cell. The roar of engines was replaced by the clang of gates. The smell of gasoline and beer gave way to disinfectant and concrete. The clubhouse laughter was replaced by the shuffle of inmates and the distant echo of guards' keys. For a man who had lived by his own rules, confinement was more than punishment. It was a slow suffocation. But outlaw legends have a way of enduring, even in chains. To some of his brothers, Tuna remained a hero, a leader who had carried the Rhode Island Pagans into prominence. His name would be toasted in clubs, his stories told in the glow of neon, his memory woven into the mythology of the patch. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder that the outlaw road ends not in glory, but in shackles. Beyond the bars, the streets of Rhode Island shifted. The Pagans remained, but their leader was gone, replaced by new voices, new ambitions. Rival gangs watched closely, sensing opportunity in the vacuum. Law enforcement marked the victory, but knew the war was far from over. For every Tuna taken down, another would rise, drawn by the same hunger for power, loyalty, and the roar of the road. Deric "Tuna" McGuire's fall was more than the end of one man's reign. It was the collision of two worlds, the outlaw brotherhood that lived by its own code, and the relentless machinery of law that refused to let that code stand above society's. His story, like so many before, carried the echoes of rebellion, loyalty, greed, and downfall. He rose from the quiet streets of Burrillville to rule as a king in leather and steel. He reigned with fear and brotherhood, building an empire on cocaine, guns, and fraud. And he fell, shackled by the very system he thought he could outpace. No matter how fast you ride, the road always ends. For Tuna, that end was not in the roar of freedom, but in the silence of a cell. The patch remains, the legend lingers, but the man is gone. Another outlaw king brought down, another chapter closed in the long, violent history of America's biker underworld.